Ever since the first recorded naval battles, war at sea has been marked by some of the most fearsome contests in military history. Naval warfare and naval supremacy has decided the fate of nations, and the power that rules the waves rules the world. Now, Top 10 will test, assess, and grade the most feared and powerful fighting ships in naval history. From mighty battleships to humble sloops, the one that can hit the hardest and fastest wins the battle. But it's not only the ability to give punishment. To claim the title of the greatest fighting ship in history, they have to be able to take it on the chin and give it back with interest. Based on scientific analyses, expert opinion, audience polls, and technical comparison, we've constructed a 5-point matrix that will rank the top 10 fighting ships of all time. Coming in at number 10 of the top 10 fighting ships, a ship that was described as the most powerful and invincible battle wagon in the world.
Hood Class Battle Cruiser. Displacement 42,500 tons. Propulsion 4 Brown Curtis geared turbines producing 144,000 horsepower. Speed 31 knots. Range 5,170 nautical miles at 18 knots. Protection maximum armor 15 inches. Principal armament 8 15-inch guns. Crew 1,418.
On May 31st, 1916, in an area known as Jutland, off the coast of Denmark, the two most powerful navies in the world went head-to-head in one of the great ship battles of the 20th century. Both Britain and Germany suffered huge losses to their fleet, and it seemed that the capital ship's days were numbered. But the British naval brass were not ready to throw in the towel, and came up with a radical new design of fighting ship. Its name was to be Hood.
The Hood was the first of what was going to be a whole new class of ships being built around the world at the end of World War I, which is the super battle cruiser. A battle cruiser which had the punching power of a battleship truly, and still had the high speed and was still fairly well armored.
Completed in 1920 and the only one of her class, the Hood, at 860 feet long, was the largest ship ever to be built for the Royal Navy. With a speed of 31 knots and armed with 8 15-inch guns, Hood represented the new generation of fast fighting ships.
One of the reasons that she is a beautiful ship is that you would prefer to have your side armor at an angle, so when a shell comes in, it tries to go through a plated angle, it's more likely to bounce down. And so she's got that nice flared hull form, which we find attractive.
The Hood has nice lines to it. It's like a nice looking car. Maybe hard to pin exactly why, but we all know a Ferrari looks good and a Pacer does not.
Known as the Mighty Hood, it was considered the greatest warship ever built, and throughout the 1920s and 30s went on world tours boasting its power and size.
Between the wars, the Royal Navy was still the premier navy in the world, and it was the premier ship in the premier navy. And if it looks the part and the Hood looked the part, then people will believe it's the part.
But that boast would soon be shattered when World War II began. Hitler's Navy had some of the most modern and sophisticated battleships, while Hood was nearly 20 years old and in desperate need of a refit. On May 24th, 1941, the Hood's shortcomings were put to the test when she came up against the German battleship Bismarck and heavy battlecruiser Prinz Eugen.
There are a few ships' names in Britain that go down in history. Hood is certainly up there. But actually, when you look at it, in terms of operational expectancy, we expected more from Hood than we got. And it really didn't come up and cut the mustard. It was an older design than Bismarck. Bismarck ran rings around it.
At a range of 25,000 yards, the ships opened fire. It only took 5 salvos from Bismarck to pierce the Hood's deck armor and smash the boast of the world's mightiest warship. Within 8 minutes, the Hood sank, and out of a crew of 1,418, only 3 men survived.
The big regret is she wasn't rebuilt, didn't have the time and the money to rebuild her. She may have survived the Bismarck, and she may have had a much bigger role.
Because the Hood was sunk in its first battle, the protection rating is low, as is its firepower score. Marked higher is its fear factor and innovation. Its service length of 21 years gets a good score, but not enough to place the Hood any higher than 10th place in our top 10 fighting ships. Moving from a ship that lost its fame when it sank to one that created a legend with its own demise. A ship that the Nazi German Navy looked to as a war winner, the Pocket Battleship.
Deutschland class pocket battleship. Displacement 16,200 tons. Propulsion 8 MAN diesel engines producing 56,800 horsepower. Speed 26 knots. Range 9,000 miles at 19 knots. Protection maximum armor 5 inches. Principal armament 6 11-inch guns. Crew 1,150.
After the bloody battles of World War I, the Allies all signed the Treaty of Versailles, which tried to prevent Germany starting a new capital ship race by limiting her ships to 10,000 tons displacement and mounting 11-inch guns. But in May 1931, Germany flouted the treaty by launching its latest fighting ship. Called the Deutschland, it was the forerunner of a completely new class of ship known as Panzer Schiff, or pocket battleship.
It's interesting the ship was laid down before Hitler came into power, and it stretched the Versailles Treaty. It shows how far Germany was already interested in moving to a more military standing.
And it was this military standing that the pocket battleship stood for. Armed with 6 Krupp 11-inch guns that could hurl a 739-pound shell nearly 40,000 yards, and capable of a top speed of 26 knots, made this class of battleship a fearsome fighter. By 1934, 2 more Deutschland-class ships had been launched, the Admiral Scheer and the Graf Spee.
The whole thought process behind the pocket battleship, and the one that frightened everyone, was the fast enough to run away from everyone and powerful enough to smash their way into a convoy protected by a heavy cruiser.
The secret of the pocket battleship's speed and power was the innovative design of making the ship lighter. By using diesel engines instead of steam turbines and an electrically welded hull, the Deutschland class was able to cruise over 12,500 miles, equal to halfway around the world. It sent shivers of fear throughout the Allied navies.
It had pretty good speed. It had a weapons package that made it very tricky for any cruiser to handle, and enough speed that it could outrun pretty much any of the existing dreadnoughts that are still around.
With the outbreak of World War II, the pocket battleships were ready for action, and the Graf Spee was the first to go into combat. Her principal role was to attack merchant shipping, and along with her 6 11-inch guns, she also had 8 5.9 and 6 4-inch guns that made her a formidable raider. In the first 3 months of the war, the Graf Spee had sunk 9 merchant ships totaling over 50,000 tons, furthering the reputation that this class of German battleships were invincible. But on December 13, 1939, that reputation was put to the test when 3 British cruisers outside the Uruguayan port of Montevideo cornered the Graf Spee. In what was called the Battle of the River Plate, the Graf Spee knocked out all the guns of one cruiser and seriously damaged the other 2. But the Graf Spee had a major design problem. Her armor was just 5 inches thick and was not protection enough against British 6 and 8-inch shells.
Graf Spee, although she had quite large guns, was very lightly armored along the lines of a light cruiser. It never intended to take on a ship of similar weaponry that she had.
Badly damaged, the Graf Spee limped into the port of Montevideo for repairs. But Uruguay was neutral, and after 48 hours insisted that the Graf Spee should leave or be interned. Unwilling to let his badly damaged ship fight another battle against the waiting British warships, the Graf Spee's captain scuttled his ship and committed suicide. With the end of the Graf Spee also came the end of the myth that pocket battleships were invincible.
Like all ships, at the end of the day, it was vulnerable. It was vulnerable to being outnumbered. It's all very well to be big and able to outrun or anything it couldn't outfight, but it could still get cornered.
By war's end, the two remaining pocket battleships, the Admiral Scheer and the Deutschland, renamed the Lutzow, were also destroyed. But during their brief lives, all three had demonstrated that they could hit hard and scare the enemy. So for fear factor and firepower, they score well on our matrix. Innovation is good, but protection and service length lets them down. So the Deutschland class gets the number 9 spot in our top 10 fighting ships. Coming up, a ship that was always in the action. A ship that could take it on the chin and give it back. A ship that took the fight to the Japanese in the Pacific War.
ESSEX class aircraft carrier. Displacement 34,880 tons. Propulsion 4 shaft steam turbines producing 150,000 horsepower. Speed 33 knots. Range 15,000 nautical miles at 12 knots. Protection maximum armor 3 inches. Principal armament 12 5-inch guns, 68 40mm anti-aircraft guns, 85 aircraft. Crew 2,687.
The attack on Pearl Harbor had proved that the aircraft carrier was a fierce fighting ship. Immediately, the United States went into a massive building program to produce fast carriers to take the fight back to Japan and avenge Pearl Harbor. On December 31st, 1942, the first of the new ESSEX-class carriers was commissioned. It was 862 feet long, with a displacement of 33,000 tons full load, and able to carry up to 100 aircraft. The ESSEX class exemplified the long-range striking power that replaced the battleship as the primary surface warship.
You have to judge an aircraft carrier's power by what it can launch from its deck, and the mahogany decks of the ESSEX class carriers could launch tremendous firepower. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the admiral in charge was able to launch over 200 aircraft in less than 10 minutes once they had sighted the Japanese fleet. That's an achievement that really could not even be matched today.
Bristling with 5-inch twin-turret main guns, 5-inch open mounts, quad 40mm Bofors, double and single 20mm Oerlikons, and .5 quads, they could put up a devastating firestorm.
They were rugged, they could take attacks, whether from bombs or eventually from the kamikazes, and keep the march forward with relentless naval air power extending out over the Central Pacific.
But it was a hard-fought contest to keep that control. On March 17, 1945, during an airstrike against the Japanese island of Honshu, one ESSEX-class carrier, the USS Franklin, came under attack. As wave after wave of suicide pilots came in, the Franklin fought for its life. For over 12 hours, the ship was a blazing furnace, and 724 members of her crew were killed. But the Franklin was so well designed and built that she didn't sink, and was the worst damaged U.S. warship to survive an enemy attack in World War II.
The ESSEX class, compared to the British carriers, did not have the armored flight deck, but they did have fairly extensive compartmentation, which allowed them to both help control fires and also control flooding. And although several of the ESSEX class carriers were hit with kamikazes, none were ever sunk in action.
In total, 24 ESSEX class were built, more than any other class of large carrier. And when peace came, the ESSEX carriers remained in service for another 30 years. No other class of aircraft carrier has served so long or so effectively. The ESSEX class scores well in our matrix by having good marks for fear factor and protection. Equally good is its service length, innovation, and firepower. So the ESSEX rightly earns the number 8 spot in our top 10 fighting ships. Next up in our top 10 fighting ships, a battleship that took on the might of the British Navy and fought its way into history.
Bismarck class battleship. Displacement 50,153 tons. Propulsion 3 geared steam turbines producing 150,170 horsepower. Speed, 30 knots. Range, 8,525 nautical miles at 19 knots. Protection, maximum armor, 14 inches. Principal armament, 8 15-inch guns. Crew, 2,200.
Launched in February 1939 and known as Hitler's favorite ship, the Bismarck was one of 2 battleships in her class, both of which weighed in fully loaded at a hefty 50,000 tons.
The Bismarck was a ship not built to treaty limitations, so she was about 20% bigger than the ships being built by the Royal Navy and by the U.S. Navy at the time. And from that standpoint, there was no ship in the Royal Navy at the time that could quite match her toe-to-toe on paper.
The Bismarck's speed was an incredible 30 knots, and with an armament of 8 15-inch main guns, 12 5.9 and 16 4-inch secondary, this ship could pack a hefty punch.
The threat was, as long as she was out there, she could break open convoys and open them up like opening a coconut for the U-boats.
On May 19, 1941, they got their wish when Bismarck went on her first war patrol in the North Atlantic. In company with her heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, their mission was to attack the Allies' vital convoys. 6 days later, on May 25th, Bismarck sighted the British Navy's battleship HMS Hood. 5 salvos from the Bismarck's superior guns sent the Hood to the bottom of the ocean. The Royal Navy wanted revenge for the Hood, and the order went out: sink the Bismarck. For over 3 days, the British fleet hunted and chased the Bismarck. Finally, on the morning of May 27th, with its steering smashed from torpedo bombers, the pride of the German Navy was cornered. For over 3 hours, the Bismarck slugged it out with the British fleet, and at 10:39 a.m. was sunk with over 2,000 men lost.
What's fascinating about the Bismarck is that the technology was in fact so advanced on it, it didn't actually understand that the Brits had not caught up with that technology. So its close-range and medium-range anti-aircraft systems couldn't be calibrated for the slow flying speed of the CARIER Swordfish torpedo bomber. So it was able to be stopped.
With the sinking of Bismarck, Britain turned its fury onto the Tirpitz. On November 12, 1944, the RAF exacted their revenge. Holed up in a Norwegian fjord, the Tirpitz was destroyed by 6-ton tallboy bombs, and the threat of German battleship supremacy was finally over. Because the Bismarck class created such a threat, the fear factor in our Matrix rating has to be high, as does their firepower. But protection, innovation, and service length lets it down, so that the cream of the Nazi German fleet can go no higher than number 7 in our top 10 fighting ships. Next in our list of greatest fighting ships, a heavyweight of World War II, a battleship that could take its punishment, give it back, and never took no for an answer.
North Carolina class. Battleship. Displacement, 44,800 tons. Propulsion, quadruple steam turbines producing 121,000 horsepower. Speed, 27 knots. Range, 17,850 miles. Protection, maximum armor, 16 inches. Principal armament, 9 16-inch guns. Crew, 1,880.
Launched on June 1st, 1940, the USS Washington was the first of the new generation American battleships that called for better torpedo and deck armor, longer endurance, and gas protection. 12 days later, its sister ship, the North Carolina, was launched. Together, these 2 ships became known as the North Carolina class. But throughout their design and building stage, there were constant changes, due in part to an international treaty that limited the size of their guns.
The North Carolina, of course, was famous for having been designed as 3 quad 14-inch mounts with a little option to put 16-inch at the last moment, because there was a clause in the treaty saying, well, if the Japanese don't play fair, you can go to 16-inch guns.
And the North Carolina class's 9 16-inch guns were the answer. Firing a 2,700-pound shell, they had a range of nearly 37,000 yards. Initially coupled with 25-inch and 16 1-inch, they were formidable fighters. By August 1942, the North Carolina was in the thick of the Pacific battles off Guadalcanal and Tulagi. It was in late 1942 that the strength of her torpedo armor was demonstrated, when after being hit by the Japanese submarine I-19, she had a 30 by 18-foot hole torn out of her side. Despite taking on nearly 1,000 tons of water, she managed to make Pearl Harbor for repairs. Meanwhile, the USS Washington went into action in the Arctic, covering the Icelandic convoys for the Allies. Finally, in late August 1942, the Washington was in the Pacific and demonstrated her firepower in the Battle of Savo Island when it took on the Japanese battlecruiser Kirishima. Using a mix of radar and optical fire control, the Washington in 7 minutes fired 75 16-inch shells and hundreds of 5-inch, which left the Kirishima a burning and crippled wreck.
You have to understand fire control. And the U.S. had, by the middle of the war, the best radar. It was so good that you could see your own shell splashes. And then, oh, I missed. I'll move it in closer.
The Washington had joined a very elite group of capital ships that have won a gunfight against others of their own kind. For two ships of the same class, both built to World War I standards and both surviving the bloody World War II, our matrix gives a good score for protection and innovation. Firepower and fear factor are good marks as well, but their short operational service life marks them down into the number 6 slot of our top 10 fighting ships. Coming up halfway through our list, a flyweight fighter with a super heavyweight punch, a ship whose creed was kill or be killed.
Fletcher class. Destroyer. Displacement. Standard 2,325 tons. Propulsion. 2 gear turbines producing 60,000 shaft horsepower. Range. 6,500 nautical miles at 15 knots. Protection. 0.5 inch over vital areas. Principal armament. 5 5-inch guns. Crew. 329.
On Sunday, December 7th, 1941, the U.S. Pacific Fleet lay in ruins at Pearl Harbor. America was at war. Immediately, the U.S. war effort sprang into action to build ships to take the fight back to Japan and avenge Pearl Harbor. 11 shipyards were given the task of building a new class of fast, heavily armed destroyer, and they were to be called the Fletcher class. Soon, these sleek ships were coming off the slipways, and at 376 feet long and nearly 2,900 tons when fully loaded, the Fletchers were significantly larger than any previous American destroyer. When one Fletcher, the USS Johnston, was commissioned, her captain made a speech to his crew that typified the destroyer man's creed. "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." Bristling with weapons, they were a floating gun platform. Their 5 5-inch guns could fire a 54-pound projectile 18,000 yards and had a ceiling of over 35,000 feet for anti-aircraft. Their 40-millimeter rate of fire was 160 rounds per minute, and the 20-millimeter a staggering 450 per minute. The Fletchers also had sophisticated sonar that enabled them to hunt down anything that was beneath the surface. Throughout the Pacific War, the Fletcher-class destroyers sank 29 Japanese submarines. But it was through attacks from the air that these ships became a legend and earned their nickname, the Fighting Fletchers. On October 25, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Japanese, in desperation to defend their positions, turned their fury into a new form of attack, the kamikaze. Again, it was the Fletchers that were in the front line of battle. Their mission was clear: target and kill any kamikaze aircraft that came within the vicinity of an aircraft carrier. In the weeks that followed, the destroyers faced more than 1,500 kamikaze attacks, and by war's end had fought in nearly every naval battle. In total, over 1,300 battle stars were awarded to the Fletcher class. By the end of World War II, 175 of these tough destroyers had been built and sent into battle, but at a price. 25 had been lost. So our matrix gives them high marks for firepower and fear factor. Innovation is good as well. Protection and service length is also good. So the Fighting Fletchers go into the number 5 slot in our top 10 fighting ships. Coming up next is a ship that is at the cutting edge of modern technology, and with a price tag of $1 billion, more than earns its title as one of the most powerful ships in the world.
Ticonderoga class, missile cruiser. Displacement 9,466 tons. Propulsion 4 General Electric gas turbine engines producing 80,000 horsepower. Speed 30 knots. Range 6,000 nautical miles at 20 knots. Protection Kevlar armor over vital areas. Principal armament 2 M45 5-inch guns, 2 Mark 41 vertical launch system. Crew 400.
Today, the U.S. Navy is the most powerful Navy in the world. And among its vast fleet, they have some of the most powerful surface combatants, the Ticonderoga class cruiser. Initially developed as a Cold War warrior in the 1970s as an answer to the Soviet arms race, their first role was seen as a guided missile destroyer. But it was felt by the Navy brass that something bigger was needed. So Ticonderogas were upgraded to fast cruisers in 1980.
You have to remember the environment the ships were built in. It was the big red menace. The Russians were building ships like crazy. They're building bombers like crazy. And the policy at the time was, we need these ships, we need Aegis, we need it now, we can save time, we can save effort by building on this legacy product line.
With a length of 567 feet and a top speed of 30 knots, the Ticonderogas are protected by Kevlar armor over vital areas. They were also the first surface ships equipped with the Aegis weapon system, the most sophisticated air defense system in the world.
This is an advanced radar that gets rid of the rotating radar and the sort of classic sweep that we all think of on a radar screen, and allows the ship to look in all directions at once and track large numbers of targets.
With its clean and uncluttered decks, the Ticonderoga class cruiser may not look that powerful, but looks can be deceiving. This ship can give a mighty punch.
A cruiser like the USS Ticonderoga class or a companion, the USS Shiloh, one of that class, can launch Tomahawk land attack missiles. These missiles are fairly light, but their ability to fly through terrain following to any pre-programmed target makes them a tremendous weapon of war.
And a weapon of war is exactly what the Ticonderogas are. Coupled with the Aegis system, they have 2 M45 5-inch guns, close-in weapon systems, torpedo launchers, and the capability to launch Tomahawk cruise missiles. The Ticonderogas can hit hard and deep within enemy territory. Known as the instigators of the completely computer-controlled ships, the Ticonderogas are at the center of today's digital battlefield and have seen service off the coast of Lebanon, Kuwait, and Korea, acting in either a peacekeeping or offensive roles.
They're a big part of patrolling waters that need to remain clear and open for other shipping, both commercial and military shipping. So the cruiser is an all-purpose, heavy firepower weapon, but also one that enables other forces to do their jobs.
Having been in service for over 20 years and on the books for the foreseeable future, the Ticonderoga class gets a good score on our service length rating, as does its fear factor and innovation. Its protection and firepower scores are high, so the Ticonderoga class cruisers move into number 4 in our top 10 fighting ships list. Next in our list of top 10 fighting ships, a battleship class that fought in 2 world wars, was everywhere in every battle, and still came through as the winner.
Queen Elizabeth class, battleship. Displacement 36,450 tons. Propulsion. Quadruple screw steam turbines producing 80,000 horsepower. Speed, 23 knots. Range, 4,500 nautical miles at 10 knots. Protection. Maximum armor, 13 inches. Principal armament, 8 15-inch guns. Crew, 1,190.
Launched in 1913, the Queen Elizabeth battleship was the first of a new design of fast battleships that were powered by oil rather than coal. By early 1916, she was joined by her 4 sister ships, Barham, Malaya, Valiant, and Warspite. Armed with 8 16-inch main guns and 16 6-inch secondary, the Queen Elizabeth class were the most powerful British-class warships in World War I.
I think in looking back at the World War I dreadnoughts, by nature of being at the end of that line of development, it represents the zenith of that design, certainly within the Royal Navy.
During the 1930s, the ships were modernized. Now with only one smokestack, they were fitted with anti-aircraft capability and their main guns uprated to fire a 1,900-pound shell over 32,000 yards. The Queen Elizabeths were ready when the Second World War began with Germany.
Queen Elizabeth class allowed there to be still ships in the beginning of the Second World War that were big, they were slow, but they were big and formidable. They had a fear factor. They kept the Germans in port.
As World War II increased in ferocity, it seemed that the Queen Elizabeth class in general, and the Warspite in particular, were everywhere.
There's a movie made several years ago, Forrest Gump, and he has this way of turning up in every major event, and the Warspite seems to have a similar knack for turning up at major events.
During the Battle of Cape Matapan in the Mediterranean Sea, the Warspite made history when she recorded the longest ever hit by a moving gun platform on an enemy warship at 25,000 yards. But the Queen Elizabeth class were not invincible. In November 1941, the Barham became the subject of one of the most famous pieces of combat footage when she was torpedoed by the German U-boat U-331. More than 800 of her crew were killed. By war's end, all 4 remaining Queen Elizabeth-class battleships were still fighting, still keeping the tradition of the battleship. But perhaps it was the Warspite that had taken the honors as the best.
The Warspite was just everywhere. So the taxpayers got their money's worth.
Warspite was one of the Royal Navy's most successful warships, and the Queen Elizabeth class were some of the toughest battleships ever built. So our matrix scores them high for protection rating, as does their fear factor. Innovation and firepower score well. Their service length of over 30 years is excellent. So the Queen Elizabeth class battleships go into 3rd place on our top 10 fighting ships. Next, in 2nd place, a ship whose flight deck is longer than 3 football fields, refuels once every 13 years, and whose power is unmatched anywhere in the world.
NIMITZ class, aircraft carrier. Displacement, 97,000 tons. Propulsion, 2 nuclear reactors driving 4 turbines producing 260,000 horsepower. Speed, 30 knots. Range, unlimited. Protection, none. Principal armament, 85 aircraft. Crew, 5,680.
In 1975, the largest warship ever built was commissioned into the U.S. Navy. Called the NIMITZ, this aircraft carrier was the first in its class of 10 ships. When the final one comes into service, they will have a combined displacement of just under 1,000,000 tons. But it's not just weight alone that makes them the largest. The NIMITZ class carriers have awesome dimensions. 1,092 feet in length, 252 in width. Its flight deck has an area of 4.5 acres that can facilitate over 85 aircraft. And with a crew of over 5,600, the NIMITZ class were a rapid departure from recognized carrier tactics.
Today, the appearance of a U.S. Navy carrier off your shores, if you're a friend of the U.S., tells you that the U.S. is there backing you. If you're an opponent of the U.S., tells you that we're interested in changing our policy.
And it's this ability to go anywhere in the world at a moment's notice and at a speed of over 30 knots that makes the Nimitz class invaluable to the U.S. Navy. But what makes the Nimitz class unique is its 2 nuclear reactors that enables them to roam the world indefinitely.
For the first time, you have a fighting ship that is not limited by fuel. It's not limited by the need to take on water as the 18th century fleets did. It's limited really only by aviation ordnance and some other critical supplies. So with underway replenishment, the Nimitz class can remain at sea almost indefinitely.
Apart from its aircraft, each ship can pack a huge punch in their own right, with NATO Sea Sparrow launchers, 20mm phalanx mounts, and the RIM 116 rolling airframe missiles. But it was by using its aircraft in the Afghanistan conflict that demonstrated just how powerful the Nimitz class was as a fighting ship.
The Navy kept carriers in place off Afghanistan consistently, and it was only the Navy that was able to provide fighter cover for air superiority. That was needed in Afghanistan so that helicopters, transports, and bombers could operate over Afghan airspace.
And again, the Nimitz class were there for Iraqi freedom, doing what they do best, supplying an attacking platform for its formidable air wing.
There's no doubt that the Nimitz class carriers are the most powerful warships ever to sail the seas. And the reason for that rests in the abilities of their air wings.
Because of their size and capability, the U.S. has committed them to the service books for the foreseeable future. And it is a future that could go on and on.
There will come a time, in a decade's time, a decade and a half's time, when there will be a new rising challenge to the United States. The maritime power projection will still be from the carrier, from its 90 or so strike aircraft. And that's why you've got to keep them. You can't afford to lose them.
The Nimitz class are undoubtedly one of the finest ships ever built. So for innovation and fear factor, score high on our matrix. With a service length of over 20 years, it has to score high, as does its protection rating. But it is their firepower of 85 aircraft that goes off the scale and pushes them into second place of our top 10 fighting ships. Before we get to the #1 ranked fighting ship of all time, let's quickly review the others on the list. Beginning the list at number 10, HMS Hood, the ship that was thought invincible until it met the Bismarck. Coming in at number 9, the pocket battleship that scared the world, the Deutschland class Graf Spee. In at 8, the fighting Essex class aircraft carriers of the Pacific War. In at 7, Hitler's favorite ship, and one that created fear wherever she went, the Bismarck. At 6, the backbone of World War II U.S. naval fleet, the North Carolina class battleships. Edging in at 5, the little ships with a big punch, the Fletcher class destroyers of World War II. Coming in at 4, the most sophisticated and powerful cruiser class afloat, the Ticonderogas. In at 3, the Queen Elizabeth class battleships that fought in 2 world wars. At 2, the largest and most powerful ships afloat, the mighty Nimitz class carriers. So, to the greatest fighting ship that our matrix has ranked as the #1 fighting ship of all time, the ship that has done it all, the best of the best.
Iowa class, fast battleship. Displacement, 57,450 tons. Propulsion, quadruple screw steam turbines producing 212,000 horsepower. Speed, 33 knots. Range, 15,000 nautical miles at 12 knots. Protection, maximum armor, 18 inches. Principal armament, 9 16-inch guns. Crew, 1,921.
On August 27, 1942, the USS Iowa was launched in New York. She was the first of the Iowa-class battleships that called for a fast, powerful fighter that could go up against the might of the Japanese Navy. With 9 16-inch main guns, 20 5-inch, 80 40mm, and maximum armor of nearly 18 inches, the Iowa seemed to fit the bill.
The Iowa class, of course, had the benefit of 2 test classes. They had the North Carolinas and the Alabamas to learn how to design battleships.
Over the next 2 years, the Iowa's sister ships, the New Jersey, Missouri, and Wisconsin, came into service, each one a powerful force to be reckoned with.
Compared to the ships that came before, she's about 150 feet longer. In naval design, a longer, narrower ship is easier to push through the water. They virtually doubled the amount of power. So it's sort of simple physics. More power on a ship that's easier to move makes it go faster.
The Iowas were designed to cruise at 30-plus knots so that they could keep up with the new ESSEX-class carriers, which were proving so vital to the war in the Pacific. But it was the Iowa's weapons that made them unique. The Mark 7 16-inch guns could fire a 2,700-pound shell up to 43,000 yards, or 24 miles. But this was not an ordinary shell.
When you're penetrating armor, there's a thing called frontal density. It's not just the weight of the shell, it's the weight of the shell trying to punch the hole through. Well, the 16-inch 50 heavy shell is almost as good armor penetrator as the Japanese 18.1-inch shell.
Hardly any battle or invasion was undertaken without the Iowas. From screening the fast carrier forces to bombarding the Marshall Islands, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Hokkaido, and Honshu, the Iowas were always in the heat of the action.
It's certainly one of the most impressive ships. As the last battleship design ever really built, it is the ultimate expression of the battleship. Battleships have a unique ability to create awe, and even if you know nothing about naval ship design or weaponry, you can sense the power that's there on the ship.
In August 1945, an Iowa, the USS Missouri, the most powerful ship the U.S. had, was the one that took the official Japanese surrender in Tokyo Bay, a fitting tribute to the fighting ship. But that's not the end of the Iowa's story. Mothballed at the end of World War II, the Iowas were soon recalled for action in the Korean War. Again mothballed, they were once more called for Vietnam, and incredibly, almost 50 years after the first Iowa was launched, they were made ready for the Cold War.
One of the reasons the battleships came back in the 80s was we'd run our heavy cruisers for so long that they were essentially run out, worn out, the Des Moines class. And so the battleships, being low-mileage ships, came back, oddly enough, as a heavy cruiser replacement.
In 1991, the Iowas answered the call again when they went into action during Operation Desert Storm. Now modified to carry Tomahawk cruise missiles that gave them a 1,400 nautical mile punch, backed up by 70 nautical mile Harpoon anti-ship missiles and their 16-inch guns. This Second World War warrior had become one of the most powerful ships in the world.
Among all the gunships of the world, I think it's a culmination of the breed. And we kept on pulling them back. I mean, it's one of those things where that whenever you had a need, the only thing that would scratch that need was a battleship.
No other battleship in history has ever had so many ways to hurl destruction over the horizon. So on our Matrix rating, firepower is outstanding. No other battleship even came close to equaling their longevity, so service length rating is off the scale. Fear factor, innovation, and protection are also excellent, which puts the Iowa-class battleships firmly into first place of our top 10 fighting ships of all time. So there it is, 10 fighting ships that have shaped the course of naval warfare and history. But it's the mighty Iowa-class battleship's massive firepower and incredible 35-knot top speed, superior armor protection, and a service length of over 50 years that rightly earns them the title as the greatest fighting ship of all time.